Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's mini lecture. I hope you've already gone through the reading for today, or at least skimmed over the concepts, because this mini lecture is going to be a little bit different than what I'll do a lot of times. Your textbook gives very thorough and detailed explanations of all the different ologies that we're going to be talking about today. You have access to some really great explanations of basic beliefs, of labels, of connections, and of recommendations. So I'm not going to go through and re-explain all of those. I don't think that's a valuable use of your time. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about my own. Uh, as a theorist, as a communicator, as a scholar, where I stand on all of these issues. I think this will be valuable for a couple of reasons. The first is that I'm teaching this class, and I feel like it's valuable for you to know where I stand. It is in no way an indication of a should. This is what my knowledge, my experience, my beliefs, my research have led me to believe, and these are the places they have led me to stand on these issues. But I do think it's valuable that you know where I stand because then you'll be able to filter what I say through that understanding. And so that's what we're going to do a little bit of today. So, welcome, come and join me as we dive into the dimensions of theory. There are four basic dimensions of theories that we'll talk about in your reading for today that we'll play with a little bit when we get to class. There are the basic beliefs or philosophical assumptions. Your textbook calls them philosophical assumptions. I think of them as the basic beliefs that you hold. So, as a theorist, you have an epistemology, you have ontological answers, and you have axiological understandings and values. Labels, or what your textbook calls concepts, these are the little bitty parts. Think of them as the brick pieces in your Lego set of theory. Connections are the way those pieces go together. You can stick them together regularly like you would Lego blocks. You can put them together with glue. You can use a rubber band. You can tape them together. You can lay them end to end. The connections or explanations are what put those pieces together. And then there are recommendations. Many theories, although not all, will offer recommendations about how to improve communication based on the understanding that you have developed. Today, we're going to jump into those philosophical assumptions or basic beliefs. I'm specifically going to share with you my basic beliefs along the trajectory of the questions that your textbook asks. So I encourage you, as I share what my presuppositions are, to stop the PowerPoint and think about what yours are. That'll be the activity that I suggest at the end, is to go through and chart all of your own philosophical assumptions. It's also a great idea if you want to stop as we go through after you hear me explain something, maybe stop and look at it yourself. So let's start with epistemology. And that first question, how do we know what we say we know? Knowledge and experience is what this is talking about here. And can you have one without the other? Obviously, on one side, there's a priori knowledge. People come into the world with some types of knowledge. And on the other side is experientialism. I am an experientialist. I do not hold with a priori knowledge in the way that we understand the word to know. I think there is some a priori understanding. Obviously, babies start breathing when they come out of the womb. But I don't necessarily consider that knowledge. So I say that all knowledge must be experiential to some extent. I'm a rhetorician, and I'm a critical rhetorician. That's one of the reasons that I say this, because I understand all knowing as coming through, to some extent, language. And therefore, without experience of at least the language, you cannot truly know the thing. Now, this doesn't mean that I have to go out and touch a humpback whale to know that humpback whales are large. I can experience that visually, I can experience that lots of different ways, but I have to understand it somehow. How about you? Where do you stand on how do we come to know what we know? Next question, how do we know what we say we know? And how sure are you of that knowledge. Is there an absolute truth that is knowable to you? Are there some truths that you can know, but you know them through a filter? Or is knowledge relative? Again, this goes a little bit to my understanding of knowledge, but I say that knowledge is relative. You think about that humpback whale, but maybe more effectively would be to think of that story of the blind men and the elephant. One touched the leg and said, this elephant can be described most like a tree trunk. One touched the trunk and said, this elephant can be described much like a snake. One touched the ear and said, the elephant is like a bat. One touched the side and said, the elephant is like a broad wall. Each of them is correct, but only through their particular engagement, their experience, right? I'm an experientialist. Through their experience can they come to know knowledge, and therefore knowledge is inherently relevant or relative. How about you? How sure are you of what we say we know? The next question on how do we know what we say we know? How does knowledge arise? True rationalism is very, very rare. Even in the hard sciences, you barely ever find true rationalism anymore. You more often find empiricism or even constructivism. I, however, am a social constructivist. I am indeed a social constructivist. That means, remember how I said that I believe language is the way that we know stuff? Well, language is a social construct. If I see language as the building block of knowledge, I have to see social construction, the way we understand and the way we share a language, as the key. Here I would reference you, some of you have heard me give this example before, but I would reference you to think of a picture of a dog. Think of a dog in your head. Are you thinking of the same dog that I'm thinking of? Well, unless you're thinking of a skinny mini beagle named Puppy Sue, who was really, really cold because she drank antifreeze and it wasn't enough to kill her, but it was enough to mess her up a little bit. And she was always a little bit weird after that, but boy, she loved to cuddle. Unless you're thinking of that dog, we're not thinking of the same picture. So even though we shared that knowledge, I said think of a dog, you thought of a dog, our social construct for that knowledge is different. Where do you stand on how does knowledge arise? The next epistemological question about how do we know what we say we know is, can you know something all by itself? Can knowledge ever truly be discrete? And I again come down on the social constructivist side of this answer and say that knowledge is holistic and systemic. You cannot know things in the abstract. Again, remember, I'm an experientialist. I'm a language is knowledgeist, if you want to call social construction that way. And so I say that knowledge has to be holistic and systemic. In the same way that I asked you to think of a dog and then told you about my dog, Puppy Sue, we have to have a social system, a holistic understanding of dog, the symbol, what I'm asking you to do in this PowerPoint even, in order for knowledge to truly arise between us. And then our final epistemological question, how do you know what we say we know? Knowledge and experience, can you have one without the other? There is a school that believes that explicit knowledge is the only true knowledge, right? That unless you had actually met my dog, Puppy Sue, unless you had petted her, unless you had saved her from drinking the antifreeze, unless, you could not possibly actually understand my knowledge of Peggy Sue. I come down in the middle here. I come down on the school that says knowledge can be both tacit and explicit, so I can know through my own understanding, or I can know through you sharing your understanding. But that explicit knowledge, my own experience and understanding, is going to generally be more useful. This is a question that comes into play when we're talking about proscriptive theories especially. Do I have to have gone through a bad relationship to know and be able to theorize about poor communication skills in bad relationships? Am I going to be able to give advice to someone if I haven't actually experienced that particular thing? And then there is another camp that says knowledge can be both tacit and explicit. but doesn't value one over the other. How about you? What do you think about whether knowledge can be explicit, implicit, or both? Next, we're going to move on to ontology, our understanding of humans. What are we exactly? Do humans make real choices? On one side is true determinism, which says fate or society or something else has set up all of our choices for us, and our choices as human beings are irrelevant. On the other side, we have pragmatism that says all humans get to make their own choices and are therefore responsible for their own actions. I come down in the middle here. I am a pragmatic social determinist. What does that mean? I think that our society determines a lot of the choices that we can make, but we get to make choices within that social structure. Your upbringing probably led you more or less easily to college, but the choices you made were still absolutely vital in what college you went to, what college you got into, and how well you did in college once you got here. Now, for somebody who came from a very, very economically disadvantaged community, or someone who came from a community where college wasn't valued, the choices might have been more challenging than if your parents were professors here at Georgia College and helped you make choices to get into Georgia College and then you came to Georgia College. But you still make those choices. And so I come down as a pragmatic social determinist. How about you? Our next ontological question, as we think about what are humans exactly, is our behavior the result of states of being or traits? Do we have individual, discrete traits within us that are immovable and unchangeable and they shape our future? This is the idea of a Myers-Briggs personality. You either are an extrovert or you are an introvert. That determines a lot about who you are and how you would interact with the world. That would be a traits theory. I, however, adhere much more to a states theory. And I adhere to this. That is actually fairly new to me. I used to be much more determinist in my understanding of humans. I thought we were the way that we were, and that's how we made our choices. But I have always had a Myers-Briggs personality test that says I am an extrovert. Always have, and I thought always would. But then I wrote a dissertation, and I spent a year and a half in a library all by myself, learning how to love research. And you guys, I love research. And now, when I really need to recharge, I often will take the time to find some time to be alone. Myers Briggs says that's not part of my traits, that shouldn't have happened. So I say that states are actually more important in shaping the way that we are. Now, we still all have human traits, and a lot of them are immovable or will be because we never change our context, but that change in context can alter the way our behavior functions. How about you? Do you adhere to states or traits understandings of humanity? Our next question is about experience. Is our experience as humans social or individual? If you've been following along with this game that I'm playing, it probably shouldn't surprise you to find out that I am a socially focused theorist. Now, you think about how I say language is a social construct that shapes all of our knowledge. Well, if that's true, language is also going to be a social construct that shares all of our, or shapes a lot of our actions, right? Our actions and our experiences are understood through that social focus. How about you? Are you an individual or a socially focused theorist ontologically? And our final ontological question that we're going to work with today is our communication contextual or universal? There are some people who say that communication is universal. I don't ascribe to this. I don't think that we have inherent abilities to communicate in any way that we would recognize as communication outside of our social or contextual roles. There have been some studies, you think about children who were rescued from living wild or living with animals growing up. They did not have an inherent ability to communicate in ways that we understand as human beings. They could still communicate with those that raised them and whatever, but they couldn't communicate with us. That knowledge has to be contextually developed and socially developed beyond something like recognizing, making eye contact with another. We don't have anything that would be understandable as communication, from the way I study it at least, outside of our contextual orientations. How about you? Ontologically, where do you stand on the question of communication as contextual or universal? And then finally, let's move on to axiology. This is about our values. What exactly do we value and why? The first question here is, can theory ever be free from our values? And should it be? An old scientific approach would be to say that yes, it should be free, and yes, it can be free. These were the same scientists who came up with theories like why racial segregation was right because people were so very different, or how women could never be smart as men because women's brains too little to be smartish. You can imagine how I feel about that axiological approach. Now, modern scientific studies say that axiologically, theory can never be value free, but we should try to make it value free. That's a very consistent scientific and social scientific approach. Today, this is something that you would likely find in your biology class or something like that. But then there's where I stand, and I say values are always implied in any work. And a researcher who does good research actually embraces and understands those values. Why? Because let me tell you about some of my values. My values are equity for all people. My values are kindness in a way that people understand to be kind. And my values are honesty. What are the flip sides of those values? Would you want a theorist developing something that you were going to use in your life whose values were unkindness, whose values were dishonesty, whose values were inequality? Exactly. I want to make sure that my values are front and center so that I check and make sure my values are actually what I want to create. How about you? Where do you stand on the understanding of values within theory? Next, let's talk about how does observing something change it. This again comes from a much more scientific approach, and it says either you can have a don't touch it approach, which says that you don't touch the thing and you have to be careful of staying away from the thing. This used to be very common in scientific studies. But then we got into the nuclear age, and we realized that even the act of observing something does in fact change it. I adhere to this also in the social sciences and the humanities. Observation of anything impacts that which is observed. How about you? Have you understood where you stand on questions of observation? Our next axiological question, and the last one we're going to address today: what is the purpose of doing scholarship? Now, there is a school of thought that says scholarship should be and is good just for the generation of new knowledge. That new knowledge in and of itself is of value. I think that's bullpucky. Bullpucky, I say. Scholarship should be actively engaged with making the world better. Scholarship should be a thing that makes the world a better place for people to live in, for animals to exist in, for the planet. Whatever that thing is, and there we go back to my values, right? My scholarship should make the world more equal and equitable. And that's where I stand on this question, and that's what shapes my values within my scholarship. How about you? Where do you think you fall on this axiological question? If you've been stopping after each of these slides and answering the questions, you may begin to find that you have a bit of a column that falls on one side or the other of a spectrum here. Now, you may find that you're still pretty diffuse all over the spectrum. That's entirely fine too. You haven't necessarily shaped your particular ideological approaches to theory yet. That's completely normal. But I bet you do have some leaning, one or the other. And on the two far ends of the spectrum are positivism, which we think of as classic, old-fashioned, early 20th century science, scientist in a lab coat with no values. Although, incidentally, he's probably always white and probably always male and probably older and probably Protestant Christian or maybe Jewish, and so But pay no attention to that. It's a positivist model. There are no axiological or ontological implications to that fact at all. Pay no attention to the always white, always man behind the curtain. But positivism holds to a finite understanding of knowledge. Knowledge can be certain. It can be totally experimental. It is explicit. It is descriptive, individualistic, universal, and good in isolation. Knowledge for the sake of knowledge is an inherent good. On the other side of that spectrum is full-on constructionism. And if that white bar all the way on the right edge of the spectrum is full-on constructionism, I'm maybe a quarter inch in from the edge of your screen there. I am about as constructionist as you can be. I believe that all knowledge is contextual, it is social, it is descriptive in its nature. This is a rhetorical perspective. Knowledge is critical in its community that seeks to make the world a better place. It is communal because it is part of the community in the language. It is value conscious, and it is knowledge for the good of society, not good of itself. And so now I want you to try this. Come up with your own spectrum and identify where you stand, at least for now. We'll give ourselves lots of room to move this semester, but identify where you stand on all of these dimensions of theory.